Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you all to this afternoon's discussion on whether Russia actively is trying to undermine liberal values in the West. And that is a highly pertinent question because since the presidential elections in the US, Russia has been the focus of attention throughout the Western world. Russia's interference or assumed interference in election after election on European soil has made Russia a solid part of the news agenda. Russia simply seems to be everywhere nowadays. The days are gone where you could scare somebody by saying that the Russians are coming, because today the Russians are already here. Fighting a war of values inside the very European Union. The Cold War is over and has been replaced with a war of hearts and minds. So what is Russia up to and what does it want from the West? To get an informed answer to that question, we have invited Ilya Zaslavsky, research expert at the Free Russia Foundation and an Academy Associate at Chatham House. And in that capacity also an author of many briefs on the liaisons between the Russian government and business. And you could also say that Ilya Zaslavsky has first-hand knowledge on the matter that he's going to tell us about, because in 2008, as an employee of the Russian British oil and gas company TNK BP, he was arrested by the FSB for transferring confidential information on the gas sector to Western and Ukrainian intelligence services. He and his brother were sentenced to 2 years of probation service and travel restrictions for the alleged failed attempt of industrial espionage. Last time he attracted nationwide attention in Britain was when he protested a huge donation to Oxford University. He is himself a graduate of Oxford, and this donation was by the Russian oligarch and Britain's richest man, Leonid Blavatnik, one of the very same billionaires that used Zaslavsky's spy case as a pretext for a hostile takeover of the western part of the oil company. The Brits were simply kicked out of Russia. Nevertheless, 2 years ago, this oligarch, Blavatnik, wanted to donate £75 million to a new Oxford Centre for Good Governmental Practices under the auspices of Oxford University, the so-called Blavatnik School. And the university took the money in spite of Zlavatsky's and many other dignitaries' protests. So he is surely a man who knows what he is talking about, so let us give him a warm welcome. And Mr. Zaslavsky will speak for around 30-40 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions. The word is yours.
Thanks, Anna. It's a big honor to be here. I feel like a little Steve Jobs with this thing on. And I'll try to be concise, to leave as much time for Q&A. There are many different topics to discuss today. It sort of started from a personal note, so I'll give you a very quick background on that and then move on to the main subjects. So yes, I'm a bit of oil and gas consultant who tried to actually work on carbon credits in Russia. After Oxford, I moved. I always wanted to do positive changes in Russia. I moved back in 2004, and actually my first job was with a Danish company in Moscow, which was called Russian Carbon Fund A/S, working on pioneering on carbon credits in mitigating gas flaring. But then through these events in Russia, which were covered at the time. Essentially, my case wasn't the only case. This Russo-British oil company was attacked at the time on 9 fronts. Back tax claims, environmental claims, apparently wrong salary for British, unfair salaries, higher salaries to Brits than to Russians. So it was a war of Russian oligarchs who had 50% stake in the company against BP, with the help of Russian state, especially with the security services. So it hasn't been it was covered in WikiLeaks and in all Western media at the time, but not all the facts came out. I did my own investigation into all this. So essentially, I was a relatively junior guy used just as a pretext to try to intimidate Brits and Americans, and it went successfully. But I know that beyond my case, there apparently the CEO of the company at the time was poisoned. So Russians were using poison already then, just to send a signal for him that he should leave. And many other things happened then. And since then, that takeover of oligarchs moved to takeover of Rosneft, of this company, and it was a deal personally orchestrated by Putin and Sechin. And in 2012, 2013, they paid BP and they paid Russian oligarchs unprecedented amount of officially $55 billion, but if you really look into the deal, it was more than $60 billion. And of that, around over $28 billion went in cash went to Russian oligarchs. And it was, to my understanding, the biggest offshore deal in Russian corporate history. And now this money is being used in all sorts of ways in the West, actually also in Scandinavia. So one company called Letter One, owned by Alpha Bank oligarchs, invested into energy assets and communications, telecommunications assets in Scandinavia as well. One of the biggest things that you probably heard, which is sort of related to this, is that Alpha Bank controls VimpelCom, which was a big corruption case together with Telenor. Last year they were fined by US and Dutch authorities on a very big scale. But so that's how it all brought me to. I was against Putin's regime before anything happened to me. I spoke publicly on the radio in 2007 saying that Russia is not yet turning into Turkmenistan and Belarus, but it's going into that direction. I tried to write some critical articles, but I wasn't very active. I actually regret being not active enough, as many other Russians. After my events in 2008, while I had to stay under travel restrictions in Moscow, I started my own investigation into those things, and that brought me to the idea that actually one has to put not personal story, but to look at the broader context. So this petition to Oxford, it's about broader context. What can you do at your own personal level? And I think I can affect, at least I hoped, that I could affect more changes at my own alma mater where the free press exists. And that's why I first tried to diplomatically persuade the university to not to take money. It's not actually about only Blavatnik. It's also those same people who controlled VimpelCom while it was later investigated for corruption, which I mentioned before. The same people had a joint business award. It was called Award for Excellence in Foreign Investment into Russia, together with Business School of Oxford in 2007 to 2011. So then they closed down this award, and there is no trace of it on the website of Oxford. We don't know why they opened it, why they closed it, who was behind it. So I think they're ashamed of it. So that's why they erased all information. And it's obviously not good if the main business award and school of government in such leading university are, run by these sort of people and with that kind of governance. So that's why I gathered, after I couldn't persuade the university authorities to deal with it, I arranged a group of Russian dissidents, activists, also some European experts on corruption. So the public letter was published on the front page of The Guardian at the end of 2015. Since then, I haven't been sued. I haven't been silenced in any way, at least in newspapers. But I could no longer attend Oxford alumni events and speak freely there. Once I actually was ousted in Washington from such event for trying to raise during Q&A, I tried to raise a question about Blavatnik. For that, I was ousted. The protesters in Oxford have been silenced as well. So actually, we see on that particular small example, we see Putin's practices coming in the heart of Europe. If you can't speak about things at Oxford University, that's actually a very worrying sign. But there are many, many other universities and academic institutions in Europe and in the US which have been affected by kleptocratic money, by all sorts of subversion, self-censorship of the press. So it's not an individual case. It's probably the most notorious case to my taste, and also the case that I know very well. But I actually, since I moved back to the US, I've been dual citizen, Russian and American, since 2005. That's actually I think one of the reasons why I was fabricated as a spy in the first place, because it was a convenient, way to present me. You say I transferred it to, according to their version, to Ukrainians. They had different versions floating around in the Kremlin press. So at some point, they couldn't decide which country I was spying for. So at different times, they mentioned America, Britain, and Ukraine. So you pick what you like. I was trying to, after I could move back to US in 2010, I tried to put some of these individual cases into broader context and some perspective. And so by 2012, I published a first paper with something called Institute of Modern Russia, which was and still is an entity in New York which is associated with the exiled oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and they gave this as a platform to different voices of remaining liberal opposition of Russia and voices against Putin. So I warned that corruption inside Russia and post-Soviet space, these huge offshore deals, this looting, it will not be a development and process that will stay contained inside post-Soviet space. It will have a spillover effect to the West in many grave consequences. So already in 2012, we were talking about using terms expert of corruption, and one of the main, one of the big papers which I managed to publish by end of 2013 was the prediction that it will have national security implications for the West. And even in my wildest dreams and understandings of all this, I couldn't believe that Russians would attack Ukraine. So I expected something grave and serious, but even not that. And actually, I was just one of the junior voices speaking about this. There have been different, much more knowledgeable experts and people talking about this since at least 2010. Some since attack on Georgia since 2008. So Lilia Shevtsova, Edward Lucas from The Economist, Anne Applebaum, and many other people who have been predicting these things, but many of them were, sidelined, not listened to, or seen as, or ridiculed as crazies. And now some of these worst predictions are true. So since then, I've been publishing different reports, and making new predictions. Some of you might have got a copy of this, but everything that I'm going to talk about today is available online at forfreerussia.org, or just Google the names, or just I'm on Twitter. Ask me in 2 words, and I'll send you the links. Or they're easily Googleable. This report, which is the main thing that I want to talk about today, can actually be summarized in 2 charts, and it is summarized in 2 charts. So while you mentioned correctly that Russia as a state has been interfering in elections, and actually I have to, and referendums, I actually have to mention it's not only Brexit and US elections. We saw consistent efforts from Russia and Kremlin, and actually I want to emphasize the voices against Putin in Washington, in Europe, the remaining opposition, we actually prefer to call it Kremlin than not Russia. Putin wants to present himself as Russia, but the myth about 86% of support for him is pretty much the same as 97% support of Mugabe in Zimbabwe. It's sort of, one day all of the people come out, even after, yes, it's 37 years, but now they are all in the streets demanding that he should go. So where's the 97% which supports him? But yeah, to return, Russia as a state, Kremlin as a regime, we rather prefer that term, they have been interfering in or trying to impact Scottish referendum, referendum on a Ukrainian association in Netherlands, which they succeeded in. Recently, a referendum on independence of Catalonia. Definitely with Brexit, now this thing is finally picking up in Britain, this acknowledgement like a year later. They should have done it much earlier. Obviously, ongoing investigation into things in US, but before that, there were serious concerns and attempts in Germany, both hacking of Bundestag, but then some attempts during elections. Macron's people have been affected by hacking as well. There was support of Marine Le Pen, open support by loans and propaganda, but also there have been other incidents, and now there is a big concern. This thing is ongoing. There's big concern with upcoming elections into European Parliament, and many other issues. So I was not joking. Yes, I know you have only municipal elections tomorrow, but I would not be surprised. But yes, this is all on state level. But what I'm trying to do with this report is to show that not everything is coordinated and coming from the state level or coordinated by Kremlin. Now, the biggest difference with Cold War times is that we have many new supposedly non-state actors coming from post-Soviet space. So it's actually not only Russia, but some of the other kleptocratic regimes imitating Russia, and also learning from each other. Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, especially petrostates, but also Belarus. And we could talk about varying degrees of this Soviet legacy. And this is the first part of my report, which I talk about this, how this Soviet legacy influenced business practices, influenced this sort of cynical view of politics that everything and everyone can be manipulated, bought and sold, or intimidated or silenced. And it all comes from this, I call it neo-Gulag, the Gulag being prison system. So the whole Soviet Union went through this, I would call it forging experience. That's how values of Communist Party were organized, values of KGB, which is now in power essentially, values of organized crime in Soviet Union. These were 3 different camps, which had separate and distinct, and I would say even sometimes contradicting values and practices. So there were still communists who believed in ideology. KGB was always more practical, pragmatic, not ideological, and didn't want party control. Organized crime, since Lenin times, they had their own code of conduct. They always hated authorities. They wanted to be outside. They even had the tops, the bosses were called thieves in law, which means they had their own law. But now what happened under Putin and also in these other kleptocratic regimes, that these 3 worlds collided, fused, and took the worst from each of the groups and became a very toxic and sophisticated group of people who, employ organized crime networks, offshore accounts, money laundering, security services. They don't necessarily engage in in criminal activity when they can subvert and achieve their aims in the West through legal ways. So I would actually say that I don't know, 60 to 80% of their actions are done through open avenues of business and through using open avenues and the open structures of the West. They hire lawyers, they hire public relations companies, they co-opt dignitaries and celebrities into their companies. There are 10 British peers, lords, on the boards of Russian companies. There are former prime ministers and ministers. Schroeder is now supposedly, not supposedly, he used to be an independent director. So by the way, that's subverting the institution of independent directors in corporate structures. But there are other examples. So for example, and also I agree that some of these things, they're not black and white, they are shades of gray. So Carl Bildt, for example, former Prime Minister of Sweden, worked as an advisor for one of the oligarchs that I'm protesting against. So they worked for Letter One in London and Luxembourg, together with some other former ministers and dignitaries. You can easily look that up. So my conclusion, and something that I really wanted to talk about, is this chart. So you can't see from there, but basically these are 3 circles of different layers of subversive activity. Some of them criminal in dark red, and the outer, when it goes to yellow, it's debatable. It's not necessarily defined by law. And all the layers at the top are on the state level. And what I'm arguing is that the corporate level and the individual, primarily oligarchic level, but not only oligarchic, they are expanding. This is the difference from Cold War times, that we have more and more subversive activity, undermining of democracy and practices and values in the West, going through non-state actors, through entities, through oligarchs, through different intermediaries who employ. Right now I have calculated about 30 different layers, buying influence in academia, in think tanks, public relations, media acquisition, buying citizenships, buying assets, hiring all sorts of enablers. These emanations of these activities, they could be very different. So interesting case, for example, this Russian lawyer Veselnitskaya, who met Trump people. So I think she's one of the representatives of this subversive activity. She's not an oligarch. She's just a very well-connected person with ties to Russian security, Russian government, but also, I would say, um, she dealt with some people in Moscow region which have connections to organized crime. So it's all fused together. Very well, all this has been very well shown in Europe, especially in Spain. There is ongoing investigation, ground investigation into massive networks of Russian mafia in Spain. And they've been very slow to put it out in the open. There are some very good articles about this. Finally, in 2008, they arrested dozens of people who they wiretapped for years, and they found the most amazing recordings that some of the top officials in Moscow were reporting to these organized crime figures as to their bosses. So, for example, former Prime Minister of Russia and head of, former chairman of Gazprom, Zubkov, is said in those files to represent their mafia interests in Russia. Since then, Spanish prosecution has actually not been able to fully execute court proceedings, and they have delays, a lot of subversion. And I know, we know from WikiLeaks, from different articles, that they shared this information with FBI, with other law enforcement in Europe. And there has been different small moves in Germany, in Switzerland, less so in Britain, to try to do something about it. But more or less, the biggest response is negligence, apathy to this, trying to sweep it under the carpet. I'm in contact and friends with a group of activists and journalists, mainly Russian-speaking, but not only, who have been exposing this and who have been writing about this. To illustrate further, these two examples, these two papers are on one of the layers out of the 30 that I tried to mention. So these are pretty much the same, on the same topic. So this is something that we at Free Russia published in May this year and presented in US Senate. It's about Gazprom's plans and practices in Europe and how they have been, successfully, more or less successfully putting forward their influence, especially in Germany. And then this was done together with the Atlantic Council, which is a big think tank in Washington. Then everything that I couldn't put or didn't have enough time to put in this report, and also with a razor-sharp focus on Nord Stream 2, not just the broader context, but specifically on Nord Stream 2, we put in this report, which came out just last month. And this, I know, is now a big issue in Denmark. You actually have leverage over this project. And one of the big reasons why I wanted to come here is to give more ammo to people who are going to debate this in your parliament and in your media. So especially German corporations, but also some other partners of Gazprom, try to present this pipeline as only a commercial project, which is hugely beneficial to apparently not only Germany but all of the Western Europe, and that it's not politics; it's just business, and that there may be some problems with Gazprom in Russia, but there will be no problems with this pipeline in Europe. So we want to challenge all those statements. So that's why we call this the first thing that anyone who really wants to deal with corporate social responsibility and governance, the starting phrase about this pipeline is corruption. So there is absolutely massive, huge corruption of Gazprom inside Russia. Literally, if you look at all the key members, not some that's secondary ones, but at the key members of Gazprom's board and of directors or management board, you will see that there are, if you just Google in Russian or in English, corruption cases about these people or investigations. You will see that there are many. There are already many investigations, very responsible ones, done with documents, done with photos, done not only by Russians but also media outlets like Reuters, Bloomberg. So there are most crazy cases inside Russia. And one of them is so-called Millerhof. It's basically a palace which many responsible activists believe belongs to CEO of Gazprom, Alexei Miller, which is not very far from Moscow and St. Petersburg. But there are also cases. There's already enough evidence to show that Nord Stream 1, the first project, which is already executed, it hasn't been beneficial to either Russia or to really Western consumers that much. So it's not only about bypassing supposedly unstable Ukraine, it's about bypassing the whole of Central and Eastern Europe. But it's also to this project has benefited Rotenberg brothers. The main beneficiaries of Nord Stream 1 in Russia have been Putin's cronies, Rotenberg brothers. They publicly received more than $1 billion for that project. I would imagine in reality even more. But at the same time, inside Russia, there are still people. So this project was supposed to bring gas also inside Russia. So, but now there are still, in Leningrad region, a region where Putin and Miller come from, there are still people who heat their houses with timber, just like 100 or 50, even 50 kilometers away from Nord Stream 1. So, and the construction of low-pressure pipelines, even in that supposedly exemplar region, the construction of pipelines for residential use have been smaller than the construction of Nord Stream 1. So that shows you the priorities from the Kremlin side. On the European side, the conclusions about implications of Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 are actually very varied. So we know that big partners of Gazprom will benefit, but what will be the end result for common consumers? Will the huge pipeline flood out LNG, Norwegian gas? No one has properly calculated it. They just don't want to calculate it. No one has properly shown tariffs through Ukraine versus tariffs through Nord Stream 1. They just don't reveal that information. They don't want to talk about it. Also the implications of just for transatlantic relations. If Russians succeed in setting big German corporations as their lobbyists in Europe against the interests of the rest of Europe, that's really a big split for the nascent energy union inside Europe, and it's also a big undermining of transatlantic relations between US and Germany and Europe in general. Also, there are very specific corruption cases which haven't been talked about enough. So one interesting case which just couple of German newspapers wrote about, but several Russian ones wrote about. There is something called Nordic Yards. It's in electoral district of Angela Merkel herself in Pomerania. So former member of Gazprom board, Yusufov, and his son, who has been head of Nord Stream 1 office in Moscow, they bought these shipbuilding yards, a dock in Germany, around 10 years ago. I have specific dates here. But what matters is that they bought this big asset which they promised they will develop. They never did. The idea for them was to try to use that asset together with some plants in Russia, in Leningrad region, to build vessels for Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. They ended up doing money laundering and a lot of corruption around that asset in Germany. German investigators opened cases about it, then they swept it under the carpet, as far as I understand, and eventually Yusupov just not so long ago sold this asset. And this story has remained, you know, below radars to my taste. But so when I have been debating these things in Berlin, in London, and some other think tanks, so when the supporters of Gazprom tell us that, you know, maybe they have corruption in Russia, but we will not allow them to do this in Europe. Well, we can already show you that this is not the case. And also there is ongoing antitrust investigation into Gazprom for its subversive activity against 8 European countries, primarily in Eastern Europe and Central Europe. But its results are very unconvincing. It looks like European Commission wants to, you know, downplay it and find, you know, peaceful compromise, but a compromise which is much more, you know, in the interests of Gazprom rather than Europe. So this report hopefully is a warning and alert of broader developments and broader context which are mentioned in this report. I would like to finish with that we need, in the West, we need to think about renewed policy of containment for kleptocratic regimes, especially for Russia, because it's so close to Europe, so has such concentrated looted wealth, which it now can employ in sophisticated ways through open avenues of business. So I would argue one of the major new layers of this policy of containment should be block some money coming from Russia, have a bigger due diligence standards and governance for investments or for any merger and acquisition activity coming from Russia. I also advocate, I definitely don't advocate, you know, closing borders or, you know, harming Russian people in any serious way. I think that much more can be done against Putin's circle. Right now, there are maybe, if we're talking really about big oligarchs and big cronies around Putin, it's less than 10 people which are actually on sanctions lists. There are many more people, you know, some military guys, some judges, some people who participated in annexation of Crimea, but actual oligarchs, there are, in my calculations, there are about 300 to 500 people of them, and we need at least 100 on the sanctions list to have some meaning to those sanctions. Right now, the existing sanctions are just a minimal layer, just to show some sort of, you know, pretense of joint response. It's just one small step away from not doing anything. This is very dangerous. And we are now talking about huge kleptocratic activity around the world in offshore zones. China is not a big proponent of democracy and how it employs its capital. So the West is really, by West I mean Europe, European Union, especially in the US, Canada, Japan, we are becoming a minority in all senses, in terms of capital, in terms of demography, in terms of GDP. Unless we take actions to partially seal our borders from this subversive kleptocratic money, we are bound to move. We never in the West had ideal capitalism. It's but we are. The analogy is with, you know, there used to be a swamp and there used to be a relatively clean lake, And the floodgates, with the collapse of Soviet Union, they opened, and everyone thought that, you know, the lake will go over into the swamp and it will all become a relatively nice lake. Well, it now looks like it all can become a swamp. And I'll finish with that note. Hopefully we'll get to more optimistic topics in Q&A. Thanks.
Please stay up here. Now we will open the floor to questions, but I will take the opportunity of having the two first ones.
Okay.
There are plenty of things to ask about, because, well, you spoke about how could we fight back. The thing is that nobody in the West, of course, likes the thought of foreign powers influencing our elections, swaying maybe even the elections. That's not a nice thought. And your suggestion was that we are to expand the sanctions so that they cover not only 10 oligarchs, but maybe 300 decision makers. Also because some of them transfer their wealth and their actives to their sons and wives and daughters, and in that way manage to travel to the West anyway. But what I would like to ask is, what prevents us actually from using the same methods? I mean, if you take the one really popular opposition politician in Russia, Alexei Navalny, he puts videos on YouTube seen by millions of people about how the top of the pop in Russia really lives in luxury. With the help of drones, he had a drone overflow the estate summer house of Medvedev. It costs billions of dollars. It's quite difficult to make a house, a summer house that costs that many money. He really had to work on that, and the result is not very tasteful. But nevertheless, that was shown to the public. I mean, the Russian elite is very corrupt. Why could you not bots? By using bots as well as they do, use simple messages that tell the Russian population about their elite, how they live, and in that way destabilize the Russian society as well as they are destabilizing ours. Is that a possibility? That's my first question, or do you have other suggestions, something that works? The other thing is that it seems to me that it's actually not, of course, Russia didn't cause Brexit. Russia didn't cause the election of Trump. They explored the opportunities. The world order is shifting, as you said. The West is becoming relatively weaker. Globalization was a good thing to everybody, but unfortunately it was better relatively to the powers in the world that do not share our values. And that means that they have become a greater opportunity. They have gotten greater opportunity to influence us. People are afraid of that. They respond to that by electing politicians that take these threats seriously. So is that an analysis that you share, that the only reason why Russia has been so successful at waging a war of values within the EU, that is actually because there has been this shift of power in the world, so that this disruption would have happened with Russia or not?
These are great questions, and obviously there are not simple answers, but to answer on the first one, I strongly recommend not to try to do to repeat Kremlin's actions and to overthrow the government, to instigate, regime change, because that's exactly what Russia today is trying to say that the West is doing. They are saying that, we are all involved in subversive activity against each other. You are not better than us. We are not worse than you. You are also corrupt. We are corrupt. Who is to judge? Where's the truth? There is no truth. It's like this very convenient Definitely, the war of values is not won through repeating dirty tricks. I don't think the regime in Russia is very strong. I admire what activists are doing in Russia. They're exposing many things, but I think their capacity is very limited. The apparatus of repression is absolutely massive, very well funded. That's what Putin has been busy with all these years. He built this. There is an enormous special services apparatus. There is now a separate Russian Guard, Rosgvardia, which is just forced to really disperse protests in a brutal way. There are many political prisoners. There are thousands of people in prisons, not hundreds. I would actually argue, if you look at the so-called economic cases, there are tens of thousands of people in prisons. Many of these are just, small to medium-sized businesses, entrepreneurs who might not have done business in a perfect way, because it's impossible to do business in a clean way in Russia. But and that's what actually Putin likes. He tries to corrupt everyone and to make everyone break the law. But they've been corporate raided, and many of the people who have so-called economic verdicts against them, it's really driven by politics, by the security services elite overtaking of all the business in the country. So I don't. It's very difficult for me to imagine that. I don't believe in 86% of support for Putin. I actually believe that the real core for him is maybe 20%. The majority of people are either apathetic or just don't believe in anything anymore. And there is still considerable liberal opposition, especially in big cities. But I don't think in any time soon they can overthrow this regime. What I recommend in the West is to stick to your own values, to actually enforce your existing laws, to acknowledge the problem, to actually talk about these cases and reveal. I know for a fact that European law enforcement are sitting on piles of information on Russians, on subversive activity of oligarchs.
Living in the West?
Yes, in Europe, in Europol, French, Swiss, Spanish prosecutions, Italians. I know for a fact that activists are meeting with prosecutors. There are publications. If one could, that's what we're trying to put together this thing, to build a macro picture of it. The scale of it is really not appreciated, and it should be revealed. That's the first step. The second step is to devise a wise strategy of containment. It's not only sanctions. It's not just putting these 300 people on the sanctions list. It's firstly, sanctions should be a small part of it, and they should be enforced properly. So to start with, just with sanctions, right now, even against those 8 or so oligarchs, these Rotenberg brothers, they're still actually successfully using their assets in Europe. They still have, they transfer to their relatives, then to their friends, they hire lawyers. It's ongoing thing. So even for the 8 people, it's not enforced. But what I'm saying, so the enforcement of sanctions and expansion is important, but it should be much bigger strategy. It should include raising standards for due diligence, forcing due diligence to look at when you have a failed state in terms of when the Ministry of Justice of Russia is supporting organized crime at a ministerial level, it's a failed state in terms of law. So in the West, you have to have all the legal entities which are partners of Russian Ministry of Justice. They should stop treating Russian Ministry of Justice as a partner. They should create their own teams who act in predictable and transparent way and public way, who judge for the origins of money from Russia. it really should stop some flows, and that's why it's difficult to do, because some of the business interests in the West who are profiting from this, they are presenting it as, you know, collapse of business. I don't think it will be collapse of business. But people-to-people contact should remain and should be expanded. I advocate many more exchange programs with Russian students, try to get them out to see the West for themselves for a year, for 5 months, for 2 months. I've been a participant of some of these programs myself. I have many friends. Once someone, you know, sees that the West is not all about, you know, bringing LGBT to Russia and, you know, throwing the regime, and I have nothing against the LGBT, but this is what the propaganda says. When they see the West for themselves, and they see that it's a complex but still more or less open and civil society, they will make their own conclusions for the rest of their lives. It should be, but the discussion should start in parliaments with the acknowledgement of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Your second question was
about whether the disruptions would have happened anyway.
It's a good question. I think after the Cold War, that's what some of the international relations experts like to play with and write thesis on and spend years discussing, that the bipolar system was, the Cold War system was actually stable, and we had the black and white, and on many levels I agree it was stable, because neither Stalin, nor Brezhnev, nor Andropov imagined in their wildest dreams that they could openly, that they could have $2 trillion from experts in hard currency, which they can loot half of it, and then employ through offshore accounts openly, in a legal way in the West. Because previously, in the Cold War, Russians could only, you know, sell some of their gas to Germany, receive some currency, maybe buy bread with it, buy some equipment, which was not of dual use, but it was all very restricted, and they couldn't openly roam into all avenues of life and buy their influence everywhere. Now, Russia is a much weaker country compared to Soviet Union, and it can't produce rockets and tanks on the same level, but it has this absolutely amazing concentrated capital in very few hands, which hard currency, which it can employ through all these sophisticated networks. So while on GDP level and on big military level this is a weaker country, in many respects it's a much stronger country compared to Cold War times. But to return to your question, I think when there was an existential threat to Western societies, they were much more mobilized. But since the end of the Cold War, there was sort of a relaxation and a lot of wishful thinking that democracy will win everywhere on its own. And now there is a lot of apathy and division in the West itself. The populist movements are on the left and on the right are winning. And it's testing times. In many ways, not many people agree with me on that, but I think we are reliving a version of 1930s when democracy was also not a popular, and there were competing ideologies. But now the competing ideology is crony capitalism. So for many people, it's actually it's becoming an acceptable thing for different reasons.
1930s, it sounds scary. Maybe we should, yes? I forgot to say that it will be recorded. You should know that before you pose your question, so you won't be swearing or...
Anders Urskov, for little Denmark to go up against Nord Stream 2, Russia, is a little dubious. We are not that strong. For very good reason, we think the obvious thing is that the European Union should take stand on most of what you have talked about, actually. We happen to have a club. We happen to have an organization which is supposed to take the European common interest in democracy and so on into its hand. We have even a commissioner in Brussels who is very eager to chase American companies. But why not why on earth isn't the European Union doing its job? Is it because Germany has an ambivalent policy, or why?
Many good questions. Well, I would first start with some contradiction to your statement. So, on some level, Denmark should definitely act unilaterally. As far as your territorial waters are concerned, and this is now the question, whether Nord Stream 2 will go through your territorial waters, through your sovereign territory, you have full authority and responsibility to act on that. And I hope you at least delay the project in that way. But as far as applicability of and response from European level, obviously, yes, European Union should do it. But even in that discussion, you can take a backseat position or you can take an active position. And I suggest an active position because the negative multiplier effect of this project on Denmark, specifically, if it happens, will be it hasn't been yet calculated, but I'm sure it will be very negative and very big. Right now there are many countries on the fence or taking a backseat position, and for that reason the Brussels, the European Commission is divided itself because there are some very strong and vocal supporters, especially on corporate level, for partners of Gazprom, who are pushing their position in Brussels, and there is not so much response on the other side, and it's dangerous. So why it's not happening? It's because, for a variety of reasons, there is a lack of understanding, there is negligence, there are some vested interests, and this is exactly what we need to counter. In Germany? I would say Germany itself is also very divided and becoming divided, and it's good that it's happening. Because previously these supporters of Gazprom and Putin understanders, so-called Putin understanders, they've been presenting it as if, you know, Germany more or less is united in its position on, you know, it's just another commercial pipeline and somehow free gift from Russia, which it is not. It's
in one of your reports, you say that if 2/3 of the EU member ask the Commission to negotiate on behalf of them, yeah, then actually we would stand gathered, united as one bloc. But does that include Germany?
It's a good question. I was told different things. There are different procedures how this mandate. It's sort of unprecedented. It's untested waters. So what I wrote was a more or less mainstream position at the time when I wrote it in this report in May. But since then, for example, I went to Czech Republic, and they told me that internally now the discussions that maybe some of the Gazprom supporters will try to push it for some different procedures, which might require more than 2/3 of voices.
Okay.
So the mandate to negotiate is a problem in itself, because for some parties it could be a way to delay the project, but for other supporters of Gazprom it could actually be a way to still push it through. And I don't understand, okay, maybe, you know, Gazprom will give up some of the operative control of the pipeline, and they will adhere to some of the so-called third energy package rules, the competition rules. But still, it will be a huge security threat. This pipeline, under certain scenarios, could carry up to 70% of all Russian gas inputs into Europe through just these two pipelines. This is dangerous from all points of view. From security, what if just you know, there is a technical problem? But more importantly, what if, you know, when Gazprom wanted to stop, it had a binding agreement with Turkmenistan to buy 40 billion cubic meters of gas, a huge amount of gas from this Central Asian country, before financial crisis. When the financial crisis hit, Russians no longer wanted to buy this gas, but there was a binding agreement. What happened? Well, all of a sudden there was a strange the pipeline blew up. And Russians never acknowledged, and we still don't know why and who did it and how it happened. I would not rule out with all the methods that Putin uses that, for example, ISIS terrorists for some reason supposedly blow up Nord Stream 1 and 2 when it's expedient for Putin. I would not rule out that scenario, because already, actually, if you remember, there was a story when it looks like Russians were trying to sell some military equipment, anti-missile system to Iran, and they send a ship through the Baltics and to the North Sea, and then supposedly there were pirates. If you remember that story, it was about 7 years ago. There were pirates who stopped this. Apparently it was, I'm just speculating right now, but I'm just showing you it's not unprecedented. Apparently Israeli intelligence services helped to stop that ship, but Russians had to save face, and they presented it as if some pirates stopped that ship.
But I mean, there is a difference. Turkmenistan was supposed to provide Russia with gas, so, well, and Russia should pay for that. I mean, why would they blow up Nord Stream 1 and 2? Then they would be the ones to lose money.
Yes, well, that was the case in 2006 and 2009 when Gazprom was losing money, but it switched off Bulgaria and some other Central European countries from gas, just to show that it's Ukraine who is the culprit, and we need Nord Stream 2 and South Stream. They were losing money, billions of dollars. In 2015, when there was a question of reverse gas flows going through Central Europe to Ukraine, it was on Putin's orders when they switched off in the first half of 2015. Nord Stream 2 started to send less gas so that there would be no reverse gas flows. It was, if you think that Gazprom is operating on a commercial basis, you are wrong. At a recent conference in Ukraine, we discussed this, and many analysts who I respect said that it goes like this. First, there are decisions that are suitable and politically expedient for Kremlin. Then the second-level decision, how the Gazprom management can benefit in a corrupt way. And only then there is commercial viability. So it's done, but on a residual basis.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, in the old days we say that corruption. Sorry. In the old days we say that corruption it really started in high levels south of the Alps, but in matter of fact, it's now south of the Danish border. That's the problem.
I don't understand. Sorry.
Well, he says that the corruption is moving closer to Denmark, but we have had several signs of that, including some Danes lately.
Corruption is just, in general, what is corruption? Something defined by law, but we see that the law enforcement in general is becoming more relaxed and confused itself, and is not up to date with all these anonymous offshore accounts, with the bitcoins, with the all sorts of new technologies, mirror trading. They're understaffed everywhere, even in the best Western countries. But at the same time, corruption is also about ethical codes and due diligence procedures, audits in many, many places, in corporations and academic institutions, and they are all becoming relaxed or neglected. I see it throughout. It's a global phenomenon, I would say. So corruption is something that is a part of a social contract and social sort of understanding at the time. So unless we start to acknowledge this problem and see it as that's another actually big topic that I wanted to touch upon, that one of the major problems why there is no response, because the, most Western societies still don't connect this external corruption coming into their countries and their own domestic corruption to their own standards of living and their quality of life and the quality of their institutions. So, for example, with Russian corruptions, even with after all these stories that have been published, which people are not reading because there is now there is a good term called outrage fatigue. There is fatigue with outrage. You know, there's too much of this information. People don't connect. So one of the exceptions is that, for example, in London, finally people are seeing that property prices have been skyrocketing, and now students and old people can't afford in their own capital. And that's precisely because all the kleptocrats from around the world, especially Russian ones, are coming into the city and buying all the property. So that's one of the first signs.
But I mean, they do that legally, so it's not a good example. They, well, they can within.
They do it legally because the laws have been so relaxed, and the laws should be shored up and changed. And that's actually what Cameron started to do, but then didn't go through. But they now want to change to not allow anonymous beneficiary owners of the property. They want to force people to show their name. And some other, I have friends who deal specifically on London property, and they do excursions, they show palaces, they do even kleptoscopes, and they want to do an app which will show the palaces of different kleptocrats from around the world. So that's part of the strategy to make acknowledgement of this problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Was that an answer to your question? Okay.
Anna, kan vi gå herned?
Ja, endelig.
Ja, det er hernede, det foregår nu.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for an interesting presentation. So, I mean, you started out saying that the main problem is that we do not really acknowledge it and we do not talk about it, and you were told that even at Oxford University you were silent. But then when Anne asked for solutions, the first solution you came up with is that we need to acknowledge it and talk about it. So doesn't that kind of contradict each other? I mean, at one point you state it as a solution, at another time you state it as a problem.
Basically, what I'm trying to say is acknowledgement is the first necessary step to do further things. I'm not sure exactly what is the contradiction.
Well, the contradiction is that, yes. Yeah, okay, there it is. That, of course, the first step is to acknowledge it and to talk about it, but you say that we don't do it, and you say that it's successfully at even institutions at Oxford, you couldn't speak. I mean, and the parliament is divided, and Germany is divided, and we do not speak about it.
Mm.
And it's only activists and great persons like you who are actually talking openly about it. So how will we get to actually acknowledge it and talk about it and recognize it in the public and in big politics?
I see. I now understand. Basically, people are, even when they manage to talk, it still has no result, and it's a slow process. It can't happen quickly, and it goes from several directions. There should be activism from civil society. There should be acknowledgement by policymakers, which will only happen if there is acknowledgement in the society, because it will the society which will demand from policymakers to act on this. Right now, there are no leaders who can lead this process. They always follow the crowd, to my taste. I mean, in the West, I hardly see leaders who can start the process. They are only following the process. But at the same time, in an astonishing way, but kleptocratic regimes themselves help us a lot in acknowledging. I'm pretty sure that after meddling in US elections, there will be now a growing response. So it's a process. I mean, there is a saying in a Russian proverb, a peasant will not cross his face unless there is a lightning, unless he's struck by lightning. It's the society should try to cross itself on its own before the lightning strikes, but then the lightning helps, and people start to react. So, but what I'm saying, it's not something that one person can do. It's it's exactly why we have these meetings. I hope there are follow-up articles, there is public debates about this, and then policymakers pay attention to this, and then, you know, they start to, and maybe, hopefully, when you, in your parliament, you have a discussion on Nord Stream 2, you don't just discuss, as they often do in Europe, they just discuss whether it's a commercial project or not, whether it's supply-demand, or whether, you know, they don't go into this narrative, which is very limited, and Gazprom people like. But then they will actually discuss, you know, corruption. They will discuss implications of corruption. Even acknowledgement of that in the public space can make a huge difference. So with Oxford University, yes, I was silenced at Oxford. I was silenced at Oxford alumni meetings. But
and that was not by Russians.
it was by Oxford administration. Yes, it was Chris Patton and the head of Blavatnik School of Government are personally responsible for that. But I managed to publish it on the front page of Guardian. After 2 years of discussing it with different journalists, I managed to put up a petition. There are now 500 people who signed it. There is now discussion inside Oxford, silently, so not publicly, covertly, but the reputation of this school is now really bad for that reason. And there are, every time now the name of this oligarch comes out, there is this reference to this petition. So there was a professor who, Bo Rothstein, anti-corruption expert, he resigned over Blavatnik's donations to Trump from the Blavatnik School of Government. And there was a big media discussion about that. But in that media discussion, they acknowledged our petition as well. So it's a very slow, tedious process, but that's for you, civil society, and fighting for, you know, human rights and acknowledgement of corruption.
And now you also have Tariq Ramadan, who was at Oxford, who was sponsored by Qatar. They don't have a lucky hand with these sponsorships. Yeah.
I was wondering, the scale of the resources devoted to influence elections in the West and so on. Do you have any estimates? How many $1 billion would be devoted to that?
I don't know how many $1 billion they can devote specifically to elections. They decide this on ad hoc basis. And it's definitely not only dollars which matter, although they matter a lot. Just to give you some numbers, in general, very roughly, under 17 years of Putin, Russia earned about $2 trillion for its commodity exports. Oil, gas, metals, timber, but primarily oil and gas. Of those money, I would say a quarter was looted directly by Putin's cronies, and another quarter is in offshore accounts of different oligarchs or non-state actors, as they called, or now under US sanctions they call it parastatal entities. There are different names for this. I call them underminers, and it's actually a project, another project that I'm working on. We're going to do social media profiles of these people, very short, concise publications based only on responsible and open sources, with authors, with good publications from Russian sources or from English-speaking sources, which will give the estimates for these people and how they have handled their money in the West. Another estimate for you, Putin has been raising even the public budget of Russia Today and Sputnik has been raised continuously. So now it's almost, I think it's over $500 million for the main outlets, for Russia Today, for its different subsidiaries, and Sputnik International has over 130 representative offices around the world. And these are not copy-paste offices. They do their own countries-focused content. So their content in Denmark will be different from their content. I'm not sure if they have an office of Sputnik in Denmark, but they definitely they don't.
It has clue.
They definitely have it in big European countries. So a content in Scotland will be different from content in Spain. because they have devoted money to these different offices. So, but it's not only money, which is big and concentrated and done through offshore accounts. It's the networks which they have managed to develop. They have these networks from Soviet times, which they took to a qualitatively new level, which now involves all sorts of enablers from the Western side. So it's not only, you know, sleeping agents now, or some kind of, you know, KGB. It's many of the people are used as useful idiots. We have this phrase where they don't even know that they're being used by Russians. Russians obviously employ all the divisions in the West. So they instigate, as you know, all sorts of divisions from the right, from the left. They sponsor at the same time, you know, racist movements in white power movements in US and Black Lives Matter, you know, at the same time. So, and on each problem they do that. So it's not only the amount of money, it's this very sharp razor focus application of that money, which I think matters.
Yeah, but now something is done about it, because now RT, Russia Today, and Sputnik are registered as foreign agents. So actually, when you watch them, it will say it will be labeled foreign agent in the corner, probably.
You see, that's what we are now discussing in Washington. I hope it makes some impact, but I'm not even sure it will fully make as big impact as was hoped, because right after that decision, now the whole Washington is flooded with all sorts of posters of Russia Today, with, say, Larry King saying that he is now having a program on Russia Today, and some of the populist movements, they have been, I mean, some of the Trump supporters, they don't care that Russia meddled in the elections. They, even if they believe, they don't, some of them refuse it. But some of them acknowledge, but they say, no, it's okay. So I don't know what else. We need to think beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
Considering the Spanish general political situation as of today, and also considering the Russian interest in destabilization processes in Spain, are there any indications that Russia has been trying to influence the Catalonian freedom process?
Definitely. There is a lot of evidence that Russia was very much influencing, trying to influence outcome of the referendum. There have been some personal links of some of the leaders. The Twitter bots went crazy, and there are. It's still ongoing reporting on this problem. I can, if you're interested, I can direct you to the what's already been published. To be completely frank, I don't follow that specifically, but I know that there is material on this, and very convincing material. It's just, to be completely frank, so much is happening every day that it's just beyond the capacity of even not myself, but even a team of people. For example, this was published with Kleptocracy Initiative program of Hudson Institute. It has KI Weekly, so it basically just summarizes in a short way everything that important happened about kleptocracy in the world for a week. Each of that weekly can be a report of its own. So there is so much going on that exactly, to return to my point, that someone just needs to build this macro picture of everything. So, for example, in relation to influencing referendums, I believe European Commission or someone responsible in Brussels should set up a commission to see if there was consistent effort to undermine electoral processes and referendums from Russia. And believe they will find that it's not individual cases. At least from social media perspective, I'm certain they will find it was a consistent effort. We now know for a fact that some of the bots that were used on Brexit, they were turned to US elections, then they were turned to Catalonian referendum. But I'm sure it can be, and now that's what, I've been to one conference in Budapest where I saw people preparing. There were actually some representatives from Sweden they set up a special agency in preparation for the European parliamentary elections. They take this very seriously because I think they essentially de facto believe that it's now a wider problem.
Is there enough evidence now where names can be named? I mean, publicly?
On what?
On who's behind influencing elections, or who's involved in murdering people in London, for example? You know, it took the British intelligence services 2 years to actually tracked the plutonium poison back to the embassy, the Russian embassy, and then it kind of died a death. We never found out what happened to the British government. Really raise a storm about it, or?
True. Several questions there. So we have names, yes. So troll farms, so-called troll farms, in St. Petersburg were built by and owned by, controlled by Prigozhin, who used to be Putin's cook and sort of personal friend, and now he's an oligarch and a very influential power broker, and so the troll farms, huge budgets, and it's been published, investigated very well. There have been leaks from those troll farms. There's been a big investigation into how recently how Usmanov and through Gazprom Invest Holding, how he invested some of the Russian state bank money covertly into Facebook and Twitter, and then they moved out. But there is a lot of oligarchic money in Silicon Valley, and the information is out in the public. As for British investigations, Litvinenko affair was actually just recently. I've read an article that Chris Steele, the supposed author of the dossier on Trump, he was one of the main people to investigate this, and it's been investigated quite well. And then it took a while for the court procedures to look at the appeals of the wife of Litvinenko, but finally they did it, and they published a report which came out, I believe, 2 years ago, and it was actually presented in Washington and other places, and Free Russia Foundation helped with that presentation. We brought Marina Litvinenko, the wife of the person who was killed, to Washington. But yes, I agree with you. UK law enforcement has been paralyzed, sitting on a lot of information but not acting for a variety of reasons, for political reasons, try not to upset, inflow of Russian money into the city, and they haven't investigated some of the other murders. And it took them more than a year to look into the Brexit. Now, finally, Theresa May is saying that it was a big problem, and it is a big problem, but they should have done it much earlier. So it's sort of mixed. There is some progress, but it's just slow.
Yeah. Do we have time for one more question? You already had one. You can get it if nobody else wants. Yeah, Frede?
Since Crimea, there has been a lot of concern about the rising threats, military threats from Russia. Would you say the threats to liberal values of the West is a bigger problem, that we should not be so concerned about the military threats, but be more concerned about these threats you've been talking about?
I think the West should be concerned with both things, and they've been happening on both fronts. So, actually, to circle back to Nord Stream 2, Sweden had major concerns that the Russians would use the pipeline and the supporting facilities for espionage, and that's why one of the ports decided not to allow use of its premises for the construction, but then the other port, the local authorities agreed. And I think it should be a big concern for Denmark. If it goes through territorial waters of Denmark, it will be a very useful pretext for Russians to try to spy on you, to gather information, to have pretext to see maybe that we need some force to secure this pipeline, because it's such it could become such a vital part of the Russian imports into Europe. And there are brilliant articles. It's not just my opinion. There are some security analysts who I quote in this paper. So that's a very individual case. But there's been a lot of activity in the Baltic Sea by Russian submarines, by very belligerent behavior of Russian ships, Russian airplanes interfering into waters, into airspace all the time, just to test NATO's response and ability to react. A German expert wrote that when Nordbalt, the power line, was being built to Baltics, there was very aggressive naval behavior from Russia, trying to intimidate the construction of that power line. So it's specifically about the Baltics. It's a big issue, but obviously the biggest challenge right now is Ukraine and Syria, and how Russians. There are different views on what's the actual stance of Russia on refugees and how much, and on what has been happening with the flow of refugees from Syria through Turkey, through Russia to Europe. There are different articles. Some people suggesting that Russia was happy to allow some of the refugee flows. Definitely, there are indications that a lot of Central Asians, for example, who go into ISIS, they have been they've been even encouraged by Russian security services to leave the Caucasus or to leave the Central Asia, or some of them are hired labor in Moscow or other big cities, and they've been encouraged to go to Turkey, to go to Syria. It removes the problem of them inside Russia, and Putin's regime saw it as as probably a better thing against the West in the Middle East. But overall, it's no longer Cold War times. It's not only about military. As I say in this report from Kleptocracy Initiative, that it's now mainly the biggest concern for me is business avenues, the financial flows, because they allow so much more influence in a legal way, in an open way, right now you don't have a pretext or even capacity to stop, because the military is so much more out in the open, right? So both things should be acknowledged.
Thank you very much. Our discussion has come to an end. You stay here. My task is completed. I will now give the word to Director of CEPOS, Martin Aarup.
Well, just to say thank you very much to both of you. Ilya, for pointing out these very serious issues in a Danish context, as well with Nord Stream 2. I'm sure the debate will go on here. And Anna Libak for hosting this event. As you probably all know, we don't do foreign policy analysis here at CEPOS, so we're very happy as well to have somebody who's been a correspondent several times in Russia to carry us through. I wish you the best of luck with your tour. I believe you are traveling around Europe
to Norway.
At the moment you're going to Norway. So thank you very much for coming here, and thank you to everyone for attending.
Thanks.